The 1894-1895 First Sino-Japanese War can be seen as Thucydides in the East, where two combatants end up fighting who had no intention at the strategic or grand strategic level of fighting each other, but are in fact reluctant combatants because their interests converge in opposing ways. The first actor is Imperial China. At this time, it's under the Qing dynasty, and this dynasty is in decline. The Manchu ethnic group is in control of the Empire of China, which is predominantly Han Chinese. And this creates a lot of internal conflict for the Manchu and the Qing dynasty itself. One of the interesting things about what is going on in China at the end of the 19th century is that it's attempting to modernize without westernizing. And this is the emergent byproduct of a couple cultural things influencing decision making. First, China conceives of itself as the middle kingdom, that which sits at the top of earth before heaven, so the epitome of human civilization. And this is borne out in both their beliefs about what culture is appropriate, as well as how to employ technology and systems. So in modernizing, they're bringing in some things from Western science, and especially military technologies to a certain extent, but not necessarily bringing in the supporting structures for them. So without the westernization of reform within the civil space, as well as certain economic reforms, the technology by itself doesn't necessarily provide an advantage. And this is, again, going back to the idea that because their civilization is the epitome of all human civilization, there's no need to change it. So you see reformers essentially blocked at every turn within the system. Viceroy Li Hongzhang is the primary Chinese actor, both in the diplomatic realm as well as the military realm during this war. He's one of the key players in the government of China and reports directly to the imperial court and to the Empress Dowager Shiji, who makes most of the decisions. But even he, being an incredibly important person at the time, has very limited control and access to all of China's resources, because the way power brokerage works is different individuals create fiefdoms of what they can control and finance themselves without necessarily leveraging what is resident within the entire empire of China. This is a holdover from the previous Confucian bureaucratic processes that led to Imperial China going into decline in the first place. On the other side, you have Imperial Japan. Imperial Japan is just emerging from the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration is what happened as a result of Western intervention within Japan itself. It remained closed to the outside world almost entirely for several hundred years. And the intervention by specifically the United States to forcibly open trade with Japan by Commodore Perry of the United States Navy leads to a crisis of governance within Japan itself and dissolution of the existing social structures. So the first event occurs in that is that the form of government changes. For the preceding nearly 250 years, Japan had been under the sway of the Tokugawa shogunate. A shogun was essentially a military ruler who ruled on behalf of the emperor, who's seen as the divine figurehead. However, this crisis by the West intervening sees the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate and the ascension of certain elder statesmen, which become known as the Genro. These statesmen create a republican style of government, but still headed by the Emperor Meiji himself, who remains a figurehead at the beginning, but then asserts power over time. And they do this by creating Western-style bureaus and cabinets to direct the reform of the government itself and the population. So it seeks out civil, economic, and military reform. And the last two are critically important because they reinforce each other. Japan undertakes significant economic reform that China has eschewed, such as creating finance to allow private investment into the government through bonds. And this harnesses the wealth of Japan. So even though it's significantly smaller than China as a whole, and in the end has fewer resources, they're much better controlled and accessible. And the power of this kind of finance is what had sustained European warfare for several centuries, and this is why they seek to emulate it. The military reforms emerge from this in the sense that because there's more access to money by the government, they're able to funnel it into what they see as the strengths of Western empires. This is exactly what they seek to emulate specifically, is the imperial form of government through military power. So at the same time, you have an ideological struggle going on between the people of Japan. At the fall of the shogunate and the essential erasure of the class system in Japan sees former samurai who had been the dominant part of culture mostly transition into being journalists. And this has a significant role on the outcome of this ideological struggle. Because the samurai, because they were mostly literate, and that wasn't necessarily the case for all Japanese people at the time, become journalists, the narrative that they shape at home is one that tends towards what we would call international relations theories of realism. The opposing idea is called Bunmei Kaika, which was very similar to modern liberalism in the sense that it perceives international struggle as not a zero-sum game, but in fact a collaborative opportunity to grow. This is overruled in the end by nationalism, driven by the samurai journalists and the culture which they are able to push. And so you see in the end the triumph of nationalism over the former culture of shishi. Shishi was the belief that China and Japan were brothers culturally and had fruitful exchange. This suppresses appreciation for Chinese culture, and for the most part you see the removal of the Sinicized parts of Japanese culture. Shinto becomes the foundation religion, though it's always been part of Japan. It eclipses the elements of Buddhism that had been there and pairs with the rise of this national sentiment. So in opposition, you have two significantly different grand strategies. On the Chinese side, their grand strategy overall is to remain the Middle Kingdom, and they seek to do this by creating relationships both within China and with international actors in the same way they've done for millennia. The expectation is that what has been true for the preceding 3,000 or so years will remain true. This is despite the fact that there is significant civil unrest at home within China. The ethnic groups are in conflict. There are many power brokers seeking to upset the system. And as I said before, the Qing dynasty is seen in decline. This is particularly troublesome for them because of the concept of the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven is shared between these cultures, but plays a more significant role in China at the time. And this is the belief that the right to rule is something that manifests itself and is not something you have to assert. So, civil unrest is particularly troubling because it seems to question the validity of a ruling party. The Qing dynasty seeks to resolve these things through indirect approaches. So, preceding this, there are multiple instances of violent upheaval at home in China attempting to overthrow the Qing dynasty. And most of these are resolved by the emperor and the empress dowager by employing Western military forces who are interested in opening up trade, luring them in with promises of trade, entering into treaties with them that we would call unequal treaties that provide extraterritoriality or rights to these Western powers that they would not otherwise have within China, and then leveraging their military power to suppress these rebellions. So overall, their approach is extremely indirect to most things, and this is because direct approaches in this culture are seen as weak, because if you have to demonstrate that you have power, then you don't really have it. On the Japanese side, you have them actively seeking to become a great world power. And the vehicle to which they believe will lead them towards this is a Western-style empire. They are most concerned about the specter of Russian expansionism. They see the Korean Peninsula specifically as the gateway to Japan and the door through which Russia may enter. So their security concerns are not at all Chinese. They are, in fact, concerns about Russia, the transcontinental railway, and Russian starting points from the Liaodong Peninsula to the Korean Peninsula down into Japan. They choose to resolve this through a direct approach, because that is, one, the style in which Western countries tend to perform, as well as it is the example which they're seeking to emulate. They are actively seeking to emulate that of German unification under Bismarck and Moltke the Elder, and the forceful creation of a new state through the forge of war. So the underlying philosophies that are very different here are worth considering. In China, it's Chanming, which is the mandate of heaven that I discussed earlier, that manifests itself without the need to be asserted by someone. And He. He is the seeking of harmony and balance. And everything should revolve around the hegemon or the Ba. This is the natural way of things. So China, as the Middle Kingdom, has vassal states or suzerain states that revolve in its sphere of orbit. And that is how things should be. That is the basis for all power structures. On the Japanese side, you see Haten and Gekkokujo. Haten is the process of bringing in ideas and melding them. So Japan, during Meiji Restoration, has sought out the strengths of what it sees as Western civilization through technology and science, and then they imbue them with Japanese characteristics. So they merge them together and come forth with something new and, in their minds, better. This is paired with Gekkokujo, which in fact is a reversal of power structures in Japan for the preceding several centuries. Before this, the word of the Lord is law. It is practically divine. So disobeying an order would result in immediate death, and because you have dishonored yourself. And this concept of honor and face, while face is shared between the two, the honor is much more important to the Japanese than it is to the Chinese culturally. Gekkokujo reverses that because it seeks to emulate the almost sanctioned and willful disobedience of subordinates leading and pushing their hires to do things. This is a product of Auftragstaktik and the disciplined initiative that allows bottom-driven refinement and sometimes, again, disobedient of direct orders. So these come into play in this campaign. And there's 4 events I'd like to highlight before I discuss the campaign in detail. First is the battle at Songwan on the Chinese side, where they're on the defense. The second is Julianchang, or Heichan, which is where China is on the offense. They contrast very significantly. For Japan, it's the battle at Pyongyang, where the discipline of the Imperial Japanese Army plays a critical role, and Weihai Wei, where the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy combine in what Corbett called maritime operations, what we now call joint operations, to some success. So the casus belli for the war is worth noting. There is a treaty at the time between China and Japan that allows for co-governance of Korea as a country. Before that, for several hundred years, Korea had been a vassal suzerain state to China, and that is still the perception by the Chinese. But Japan, in the Western style, sees treaties as binding and formal, whereas China does not. There is a rebellion within Korea, the Tonggak Rebellion, where people pushing back against some of the Japanese-imposed reforms, the second-order effects coming from the Meiji Restoration within Korean culture, are pushed back on by certain parts of traditional conservative Korean culture. And King Kojong of Korea requests military assistance from China. This treaty stipulates specifically that if either China or Japan seeks to involve themselves militarily in the Korean Peninsula beyond what is present, they have to notify the other. And the diplomatic missive from China to Japan seeks to ignite a conflagration because it refers to Korea as a vassal state and not as a co-administered state. And this is the final straw in a series of diplomatic engagements between the two countries that leads to war. Japan, under international law, leverages this treaty as a cause to go to war, a legal justification for it. And so they then project forces from Japan into the Korean Peninsula, despite the fact that the Tonggak Rebellion has already been suppressed and against the wishes, to some extent, of some of the Japanese population. And this is where the Meiji Restoration cements itself in Japanese society, because up to this point, the reforms haven't necessarily been bought on by all people in Japan. But success here represents potentially the crowning achievement of the Meiji Restoration. So 2 armies are projected from Japan onto the Korean Peninsula. The first is led by General Iwao, and they proceed on an amphibious landing into the area of what is now Wonsan, and then start crossing the peninsula. The second moves from Yokosuka into the area of what we now call Incheon. And this is where the first decisive ground engagement occurs. And this occurs at Songwon. Chinese forces are in the defense. They have prepared defenses, but they do not have modern technology. They also do not seek to maneuver whatsoever while they're in the defense and allow Japanese forces to close on them. And this is where the military reforms of Japan make themselves very apparent, because they come with modern weapons, modern leadership, and a modern method of fighting. They seek the envelopment and reduction of salients, so that the classic Kesselschlacht of German Bewegenkrieg-style maneuver warfare. They also employ their fires extremely effectively well. So their ground maneuver forces make contact with the enemy, fix them in place with small arms fire, maneuver around the flanks to present them with multiple dilemmas, reduce them with fires, and then clear with ground maneuver. And Songwon is the model for which the next couple months of fighting occur. The Chinese forces are completely ineffective, are reduced rapidly, and the remnants of them retreat all the way back to Pyongyang. So on 28 July, the Battle of Songwon marks immediately the effective securing of 3/4 of the Korean Peninsula by Japan. Moving forward to 1 September, both field armies converge against Pyongyang. And while it is an echo of Songwon in what the outcome is, it's a much more significant engagement for the Chinese and a much greater loss. It's also a much higher risk operation for the Japanese. The second field army serves as the fixing force, and the first field army serves as the exploitation force. And China has had multiple months to prepare for this. They brought in new forces all the way from the Shandong Peninsula via land down to Pyongyang, and they've reinforced their positions en route to Pyongyang. What's interesting too is the structure of the defense is particularly fragile. You have about 5 different army commanders on the Chinese side, none of which are coordinating with each other, none of which are beholden to each other, and there's no overall commander for the defense. And again, they remain behind their fortifications, trusting them against modern indirect fires to repel the Japanese. And the Japanese, to destroy them, in fact, conduct the first known night amphibious, in the modern world, night amphibious crossing of a river to move around their defenses, approach from a point of relative advantage, and reduce the pocket of Pyongyang. With the destruction of Chinese forces on Pyongyang, that removes all Chinese influence on the Korean Peninsula and opens the door potentially to further exploitation. Very soon after, on 13 September, the first decisive naval engagement occurs. The Navy has not been sitting on its hands while the Army has been maneuvering. They've been practicing what they see as command of the sea in the Mahanian sense, and seeking to exploit the sea locks to reinforce their ability to maneuver on the ground. And they're able to engage the Beiyang fleet, which is the primary Chinese fleet in the region. Viceroy Lee has held this Beiyang fleet, which is his own personal tool, essentially, behind the Yalu Wei Highway line. And he does this because he sees his primary role as protecting the capital of Beijing up here. However, what this allows, of course, is for Japan to have almost unrestricted access around the Korean Peninsula and leverage their naval power. The Battle of Yalu is particularly interesting because it's tactically indecisive, but operationally and then strategically decisive. The combined fleet of the Japanese Navy engages the Beiyang fleet, which is similarly equipped, and their losses are basically comparable. Almost the same number of capital ships are lost, and both fleets retreat without a true decision in the sense of the destruction of one fleet. What happens after is what is decisive. Lee directs the fleet to go to port in Wei Highway, where the Japanese promptly blockade it. So this means then that at this point there's no Chinese naval influence throughout the theater. And because the fleet is kept within Weihaiwei, it's not able to affect subsequent Japanese operations. Understanding this, Japan immediately seeks to seize what it sees as key terrain. And there's two objectives here. The first is the major confluence of ground lines of communication in the vicinity of Juliancheng and Haichen. This is where all the routes from the capital and the rest of China converge, and where one would have to pass in order to get down to the Korean Peninsula. It's also a key blocking position to enable Japan to get to Port Arthur, which is one of only two ports that have facilities to support the Chinese fleet, as well as one of only two ports to support major maritime operations. So in October, the initial Japanese seizure objectives in the vicinity of Juliancheng occurs, and Japan rapidly transitions to the defense because there's no desire at this point to proceed beyond. Japanese forces, much like the Germans that they seek to emulate, quickly dig in, create prepared defensive position with interlocking fields of fire and integrated indirect fires. And at this point, that's critical because the character of war for the Chinese is changing. Up to this point, these Chinese armies have been essentially second-rate forces that are ill-equipped and are fighting the away game in a vassal state. Now you're fighting in China proper, what has always been part of China. And Li has been able to employ what are increasingly modernized and motivated armies. So China transitions in this region from the defense to the offense. And the fighting is quite bitter. Though Japan is ultimately successful mainly through use of their indirect fires, the Chinese forces inflict significant casualties on the Liaodong Peninsula. However, while that's being blocked, Japan decides that it needs Port Arthur. And this is also where a significant strategic event occurs in terms of narrative and perception of the war outside of the theater. Throughout this long ground campaign from central Korea into Port Arthur, the Japanese have seen the Chinese armies committing significant atrocities, both against Japanese civilians and soldiers that they find, as well as the Koreans. And at Port Arthur, this comes to a head, because as Japanese troops enter the city, they see the severed heads and mutilated bodies of Japanese soldiers. And the discipline of the Japanese army cracks, because the Japanese soldiers then seek out retribution, both against the Chinese civilians that are in Port Arthur and, of course, the Chinese military. This is sometimes called the Massacre of Port Arthur because of the destruction that is wrought. But the reaction on both sides is telling. China, of course, the Chinese media has been talking throughout the war about how Japan commits atrocities, but they've also been saying that they've won every battle. And this is a product of the fact that Chinese commanders are fired if they lose a battle and are executed, as well as just misinformation that's spread by the Chinese government because it doesn't want to admit any weaknesses. Japan, throughout this campaign, has allowed unrestricted media access to their ground forces as well as to their engagements. So there are Western reporters on the ground. And this is an example of Japan understanding there's a two-level game here. They have to message their domestic population, they have to message their enemy, and they also have to message their potential allies. So they launch an immediate investigation, seek to rein in the behavior as soon as possible, and maintain legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. Port Arthur is seized, and there remains now only one port in which China has any power and one port in which Japan desires to project power. So, having complete command of the sea locks at this point, Japan decides to launch its next major operation to the Shandong Peninsula. Ground forces are moved from Port Arthur to Shandong, where they maneuver over time around the defenses of Weihaiwei. Weihaiwei, again, is where the Beiyang fleet is anchored, and it's the last remaining bastion of Chinese military power in the region. Weihaiwei is reduced through simultaneous ground attack and the employment of torpedo boats, something that Japan, a novel use of torpedoes that Japan is attempting to validate as useful. And in fact, the ground forces turn the defensive weapons of Weihaiwei against the Beiyang fleet as it's anchored, with the torpedo boats finishing the job. This removes all Chinese naval influence on this side of the Asian continent. And in response, in fact, the Qing dynasty dissolves its admiralty board since it no longer has a job. This is, of course, the turning point for diplomatic relations, because the loss of this port causes the Empress Dowager to take significant note of where things are going and forces them to the negotiating table. Because, of course, at this point, Japan threatens the capital both on land and via sea. China sends, of course, Viceroy Li to Japan to conduct the negotiations. And this is an extremely savvy move for the Chinese for many reasons. First, Li is their primary Chinese contact with the Russians. So he understands the adversary that Japan is actually concerned about and has been conducting the negotiations with Russia. He's also an elderly man, which carries a lot of weight in Japanese and Chinese society. So he's a figure of some renown in Japan before the war, much less during, since he's often called the Bismarck of the East. He also has relationships with the United States, which Japan is seeking out. When he arrives in Shimonoseki to conduct these negotiations, the enmity which the Japanese government had stirred for this war almost inflicts a self-inflicted gunshot wound, because a young Japanese patriot attempts to assassinate Viceroy Li. And the bullet that he actually shoots into the Viceroy's face remains there until he dies many years later. This is a significant boon for China, because they're at a major disadvantage in the negotiating table. They were near capitulation on significant terms within what becomes the Treaty of Shimonoseki. But this causes the emperor to intervene directly, and in the unequal dialogue between the ruler and the statesman, as well as the military forces, the emperor then dictates the terms of the Treaty of Shimonoseki that are more forgiving to China as recompense for this slight against not only Viceroy Li, but in its own government, which was supposed to be protecting him. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, though, is not the final word, because even as that treaty is being conducted, Japan is conducting another campaign to reduce the island of Formosa and secure it. At the same time, when the treaty is announced to the world, international actors intervene in what's known as the triple or tripartite intervention. Russia takes issue with the fact that Japan has control of the Liaodong Peninsula, because it wants control of the Liaodong Peninsula, and it manages to pull in both Germany and France. France's interests in China are actually in Western China as a result of the previous Sino-Franco War, and it has great relationships diplomatically and militarily with Japan. However, it does not want to be isolated diplomatically within Europe. Germany wants to distract Russia from its own borders and move their interests to the east, as well as leverage Russian support for actions against France. So these three countries then dictate terms that are different from the Treaty of Shimonoseki. And this gives the Liaodong Peninsula to Russia and leaves what is essentially a gaping chest wound here, an open sore in the Japanese security plan. This is also extremely disappointing for the Japanese, because it is apparent to them that they are not seen as a great power by the Western countries, and that their security is still in danger because of the Liaodong Peninsula being with the Russians. And this intervention has significant lasting effects over time. So moving to a more in-depth look at the conditions that create this conflict, and especially their outcomes, it's interesting to consider the differences. China has a negative goal in the way that Clausewitz used it. And with the negative goal, you may be in the stronger form of war, which is the defense, but it means that you're not able to dictate when and where destruction occurs. You must wait for it to come to you. And this is apparent not only in the form of war that they've taken, the defense, but the manner in which it's conducted. They're essentially conducting almost a passive indirect defense in which they don't seek to maneuver against the enemy. And this has long-standing implications for them as tactical failure leads to operational and strategic failure. They also have no regard at the time for international law, nor do they have the same understanding of just war theory. And this significantly affects the perception of the conflict by Western powers, and especially with respect to the differences in opinion between China and Japan. Overall, the Chinese system can be seen as one that is loosely coupled This is a result of the cultural divergences already discussed, as well as the fact that they haven't modernized their military forces. So Li Hongshan does not have a general staff to assist in planning and directing. He doesn't have systems in place to disseminate information, and he's unable to synchronize the efforts of his subordinate leaders. Now, while this overall loose coupling means that China can absorb this conflict essentially without it being a significant existential event, it also means that it's unable to leverage the resources it has to effectively respond. Japan has a positive goal. They are not only in the offense, but they are dictating the tempo and retaining the initiative because they are dictating tempo. They keep this tempo throughout and are able to synchronize their efforts across multiple lines of operation and lines of effort simultaneously. One that provides them significant weight in the diplomatic sphere afterward is the narrative maneuver that they're conducting by employing international law, using it as a shield for their actions, as well as ensuring that the manner in which they conduct the war is in line with Western perceptions of how that should be done, and that they resolve it with mechanisms that are perceived as legitimate. The Japanese system is one that is very tightly coupled, and this is a product of the fact that both the political and military spheres are more or less overlaid. There's significant influence upon political decisions by the military, and the political aims are in fact the military aims. But as well as the modernized Japanese military has what we understand to be modern systems. It has extremely robust logistics. It has modernized maneuver warfare and modernized weaponry and modernized communications. The initial starting conditions are also very interesting to contrast. For China, the initial conditions were the Opium Wars, the Arrow Wars, and the Taiping Wars, as well as the Sino-Franco conflict. The first three were domestic wars fought and eventually resolved through Western intervention at the request of the Chinese Qing Emperor. The Sino-Franco War, or the Franco-Sino War, is one of the first major imposed peace settlements that China enters into as an indirect solution, mostly because they don't see extraterritoriality as being an issue. Allowing Western access to ports and resources is perfectly acceptable in maintaining harmony and balance. Finally, the structure of the Chinese government and its political bodies is significant. Because it is so fragmented, and because you have fiefdoms split between causes, they're not able to leverage the massive resources that exist within the Empire of China as a whole. This leads directly to... this is also interesting to note that it's halfway through the century of humiliation. The preceding 50 years that are now referred to, or this 100-year period, which is now referred to as the century of humiliation, is halfway through. Because in the eyes of modern China, Western powers and now an Asian power have been exploiting the weakness of certain aspects of Chinese society. And this is a grudge they carry forward to this very day. This is also the beginning of the Chinese Civil War. So, the imposition upon Chinese society leads to significantly more civil conflict. Sun Yat-sen is a leader that rises in the next couple of years to attempt to reform Chinese society and fix it. And two of his disciples were Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. So there's a direct line from the disturbance caused by this war in Chinese society to its eventual resolution, at least on the main continent of Asia, in 1949. On the Japanese side, initial starting conditions are interesting to consider for why they fight, where they fight. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was the shogun before Tokugawa took over in 1600, and he had invaded the Korean Peninsula in the 16th century and got as far as Pyongyang. So the physical location of Pyongyang was significant to the Japanese forces fighting it, as well as to the narrative at home in Japan. And getting beyond that was a significant boon to their efforts. The Meiji Restoration, of course, sees the Japanese government, military, and society in a very different place, and this serves to cement in place the reforms of the Meiji Restoration. The unequal treaties that Japan had been subject to, it sees as the primary vehicle for it to impose upon its neighbor. And so, using this as justification for why they should no longer have treaties with the West, saying they are on equal terms legally and governmentally, they impose that constraint upon their neighbor. That, of course, leads directly to the Triple Intervention, which sours Japan. Then the eventual naval treaties of Washington and San Francisco set conditions after World War I for Japanese designs on what becomes the East Asia co-prosperity sphere that it seeks to establish during World War II. So looking all the way back to Thucydides' triptych on the forces that lead to war, as well as Clausewitz's paradoxical trinity as the character of a war that's fought, China begins with practically no honor or interest at stake and very little fear, though that does rise over time as there's more pressure against Beijing. This translates into the Chinese character of the war being governed almost entirely by policy and probability in the form of Li Hongzhang in both cases, but as enmity rises, it moves towards the passion. For Japan, it has a moderate amount of fear, mostly because of its concerns over Russia, and not really China directly. But it definitely sees the highest amount of honor and interest at stake in this war and in cementing reforms at home. End.